So today we're going to explore the question, what can we know? Is knowledge possible? And if so, what can we know about? So this presentation is basically an introduction to skepticism. So here's what we're going to cover today. Skepticism is the view that human knowledge is importantly limited in some way. And there's sort of two kinds of skepticism. One is global skepticism, which says all or almost all of our knowledge is limited, and we basically can know nothing or almost nothing. And then local skepticism would say a certain type or subset of our knowledge is limited. So, you could be a local skeptic about knowledge of the past. Maybe you think we can't trust our memory. Or you could be a local skeptic about scientific knowledge or philosophical knowledge or something. But local skeptics don't aim to challenge all of our knowledge. They just aim to challenge a certain sort of sphere of it. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about two kinds of skepticism: academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism, but we're going to focus more on academic skepticism. Then we're going to talk about two responses to skepticism: the Moorean response and the pragmatic response. And then we'll close with a view that is in some ways related to skepticism, but also importantly different, and that's the simulation argument. Okay, so let's first talk about the difference between academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Academic skepticism is a type of global skepticism, and it says we know nothing or knowledge is impossible. You could also say we know almost nothing or most knowledge is impossible, and that would probably also be considered a kind of academic skepticism. But basically it says we know nothing or almost nothing. Pyrrhonian skepticism, on the other hand, is slightly different. So it says we ought to withhold judgment on all matters, including questions about the scope of our knowledge. So if you ask a Pyrrhonian skeptic, is knowledge impossible? They would say, well, I don't know. I'm withholding judgment on that. And Pyrrhonian skeptics really emphasize the importance of looking for new evidence and trying to doubt things. We always need to be inquiring and looking for new evidence. And sort of when we aren't looking for evidence about something, they're worried that leads to dogmatism. So they also argued, which I think is kind of interesting, that this sort of withholding judgment and always being open to new evidence is the way to achieve inner peace and tranquility. And I think this is kind of funny because when I start getting myself in a really skeptical mindset and I start doubting if my family and friends exist or start doubting if the past is real, I actually don't really feel inner peace or tranquility, but this is part of their argument. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they said. I think they were really worried about dogmatism, so they thought this would be a good way to avoid dogmatism, and if you can avoid that, that could lead you to inner peace. Okay, so that's Pyrrhonian skepticism. Now we're going to sort of shift our focus to academic skepticism, the view that we can know nothing or almost nothing. And we're going to focus on Descartes' argument in the Meditations, especially Meditations 1 and 2. So there's sort of four parts to Descartes' argument. The first thing is what Descartes calls, or at least a lot of people call it this, I don't know if actually Descartes used this exact phrase, but it's called the method of doubt. And basically Descartes said, I'm here to doubt everything I can. I want to, kind of get it down to just the bare minimum, the things that I cannot doubt, and figure out sort of what that foundation of my knowledge is. So he starts by thinking, what are things that I can call into doubt? What are things that I can think about the possibility I might be wrong? And here's how he goes. Well, you might think I can't doubt that there's a table in front of me. I can't doubt that there's a computer screen in front of me. But Descartes says, look, how do you know you're not in a dream? A lot of times when you're dreaming, you think it's real. And I don't know about you guys, but I've been dreaming and then woken up and thought I was awake, but then I was actually just in a different dream. You could be in the Matrix, for those of you who have seen that movie, where people have something plugged into their brains that makes them experience the world as we experience it, but really they're just sitting in this little pod and they don't actually experience sort of the bottom level of reality. They're just given these sensations. You could also be a brain in a vat, where a computer, again, gives you sensations, and then as you make a decision, the computer gives you sensations that make it seem like you've actually made that decision. So you decide to pick up this cup of coffee and drink it. And then the computer gives you the simulation of tasting coffee. So this seems like a pretty interesting way we can sort of call a lot of our sensory experiences into doubt, if we're in a dream or a brain in the vat or in a matrix. But you might say, well, I can at least know that like 1 + 1 = 2, or that a square has 4 sides. And this is where Descartes brings in the evil genius argument. And he says, well, you might think you could know that, but what if there's some powerful evil genius? And this evil genius is so powerful that he can deceive you even about the truths of math and logic. So maybe you're a brain in a vat and he's giving you these false beliefs about math and logic. If he was doing that, then it's hard to even know that math and logic are right. So Descartes, in his method of doubt, sort of comes down to this one statement, and it's called the cogito. And he says, I think, therefore I am. And he says, well, even if there was an evil genius deceiving me about the world around me and about math and logic, that evil genius couldn't deceive me about the fact that I'm thinking right now. And because I'm thinking, that is, I guess, proof that I exist. So the one thing Descartes thought he could know for sure is that he is a thinking thing. And I think a lot of people find this powerful. They think, yeah, because I'm thinking, I can know that I exist. And that's at least like the one fundamental piece of knowledge that I don't have to give up, that I can't doubt. So it's a version of Descartes' version of academic skepticism would say, you can doubt almost everything except maybe not your own existence. However, it's interesting, Hume was another skeptic who wrote a little bit later than Descartes, and he responded to Descartes' cogito, and he said, how do you know that you are a thing? Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a thought or a feeling or a belief that is floating around, but that doesn't mean there's a self. So, you could say, I think, or there's a thought. But why does there have to be a you that's thinking? There might just be like a thought floating by or a belief floating by. So Hume didn't think Descartes had even given us a reason to think there's a self. So even the cogito, some people think Hume showed, can be doubted. So this kind of brings us to the question, can we know anything for sure? Is anything beyond doubt? And what's interesting is that most of the things that we think we know, kind of on reflection, we can bring into doubt. And this ability to doubt something seems to threaten us knowing it. So the fact that I can doubt that there's a computer screen in front of me because I could be dreaming, that seems to kind of take my knowledge of this computer screen away, at least at first blush. And we'll talk about some responses to this, but it does seem to at first blush. So the question I want you to think about is there anything that's beyond doubt? Is there anything that we can't think about the possibility that that belief might be false or that belief might not be knowledge? All right, so that's sort of skepticism and some motivations for it. And now we're going to talk about two responses to this academic skepticism, this view that we can know nothing or almost nothing. And the first response is Moore's response. So Moore made the following argument. Moore said, here's a hand. I know this is a hand. Hands are external objects. So therefore, I can know that there are external objects. And what Moore said is that premises 1 and 2, that here's a hand, so I know there's a hand, and hands are external objects, they're more plausible than the premises in the skeptic's arguments, which is like, I can doubt the external world because I'm dreaming. If I can doubt it, then I don't know it. Therefore, I don't know it. And Moore's like, no, there's a hand right here. That's common sense. And if you give me an argument that there's not a hand right here, then your premises, I'm going to say one of your premises is false because it's so obvious that there's a hand right here. Is this going to convince the skeptic? Maybe not. But we can't lose sight of common sense when we're sort of doing our philosophical arguments and our philosophical theorizing. So Moore said, look, premises 1 and 2 are common sense, and I can know them. And that is, why the skeptic's wrong. So I think the big problem, at least one of the really big problems with Moore's response, which I do think is really interesting. It's like, look, there's a hand. That's pretty plausible. That's common sense. But if Moore's right, what explains the appeal of skepticism in the first place? Like, how does skepticism so easily get off the ground? Why do we assign Descartes in so many philosophy classes? And a lot of people think, wow, this is really compelling. Like, can I know there's an external world? What if I am dreaming? And if there's something really misleading about that or that defies common sense, why does it resonate with so many people? So I think the Moorean at least needs to give us some kind of explanation there. Okay, the second response to skepticism is what I call the pragmatic response to skepticism. And basically, what this response does is it sort of looks at our options and looks at the ways the world could be and says, we have a lot to gain if we believe in the external world and a lot to lose if we don't. And here's why. So there's two options. You could believe in the external world as you perceive it, or you could not believe in the external world as you perceive it. And then there's two possibilities. Maybe most of our perceptions of the external world are reliable, or maybe most of them are unreliable. So if our perceptions of the external world are mostly reliable, if the world is sort of the way that it seems to us, and we believe in the external world as we perceive it, we'll get lots of true beliefs about the world around us. If we continue to believe, you know, there's a table here and there's a cup there, and my family and friends exist. And we can go on and kind of live a meaningful life. We can pursue genuine and important relationships and life projects. So if our perceptions about the external world are mostly reliable, but we don't believe in the external world as we perceive it, then this will probably lead us to at least a decent amount of stress and anxiety. We'll be constantly second guessing ourselves. You know, you'll say, yeah, I can't know there's an external world. And then you go downstairs to refill your coffee and you find yourself believing there's coffee here and there's a coffee mug and I'm pouring coffee into it. And you're like, no, I can't believe that. And then imagine, like, you can't believe that your family and friends exist. You can't believe that you're actually achieving anything when you kind of go get a PhD in philosophy or go, whatever important life projects you're trying to do. I love how a PhD in philosophy is the only one I can think of. But if we suspend judgment about all these things in the external world, that could lead us to this double-mindedness and stress and confusion, and we could lose out on some meaningful relationships and on important life projects because we're constantly trying not to believe in the things around us. So let's suppose instead that we are, let's say, brains and bats, and that most of our perceptions of the external world are unreliable. Well, if you went ahead and believed in the external world anyway, and you are a brain and a bat, you would have a lot of false beliefs, but it wouldn't really matter anyway. Like, you're a brain and a bat. I guess who cares if you have false beliefs? You're kind of screwed, you know? And if you don't believe in the external world and you are a brain and a bat, yeah, you would avoid having a lot of false beliefs about the way you perceive things. But again, it doesn't seem like it would really matter anyway. You're a brain and a bat. And so basically what the pragmatic response to skepticism says is, there's a lot to gain if the external world is the way we think it is and we believe in it. And there's a lot to lose if the external world is the way we think it is and we don't believe in it. And if our perceptions of the external world are mostly unreliable, there's not much to gain or lose either way. Like, you're a brain and a bat, what can you do? So it basically says, go ahead and believe in the external world. That's sort of the best, given sort of the risk of not believing in the external world. I think the main problem for this kind of response is, can this kind of practical argument give us knowledge of the external world? Maybe it says believing in the external world's our best bet, but the question we sort of started with is, what can we know? And it's not clear that it actually answers that challenge. Maybe it answers a different challenge, like what should we believe about the external world, but it's not clear that it would lead us to knowledge. Okay, the final thing that I want to touch on is what's called the simulation argument. And this argument is made by Nick Bostrom, and it's in some ways related to skepticism, but in some ways different. So we're going to talk about that too. So according to the simulation argument, one of three possibilities obtain. One is the human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a technologically mature stage. And Nick Bostrom calls this the doom hypothesis. And so the idea is that, our technology is advancing rapidly. We're having these, better and better artificial intelligence. But before we reach this stage where we can simulate life as we know it, our species is going to go extinct. So that would be kind of sad if we all die out or something. Here's the second possibility. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their ancestors. So the thought is, well, if we reach this technologically mature stage, we'll have very, very, very powerful computers. And these computers can easily run simulations of the past history of the world, including sort of what the ancestors of this world went through. And it wouldn't be difficult for these computers to do that because they have so much power, so much maybe bandwidth, that might be the wrong word, but I think you get what I'm saying. So for this to be false, what you would have to argue is that these civilizations, these future civilizations, they're just not interested in running ancestor simulations. And you would actually have to argue that almost none of them are interested in running ancestor simulations, because even if some of them run ancestor simulations, that's enough for the argument to go through. And then the third possibility is that we're actually living in a computer simulation, almost certainly. So what's interesting about this argument is that if possibility 1 and possibility 2 are false, then it's very likely we're living in a computer simulation. And you might think, well, there's some chance that 1 is true and some chance that 2 is true. But given that I think there's a good amount of room to doubt each of those, this means that there's at least a decent probability that we're living in a computer simulation. So how does this simulation argument interact with skepticism? Well, it's not exactly skepticism. It doesn't use the method of doubt where it says, let's just doubt everything we can. And in fact, it actually begins by assuming that the world is largely the way that it seems. It assumes that the scientific method is a good method, that we're making these technological advances, etc. But then it explores the consequences of these technological advances, and it explores what are the potential things that these computers can do in the future. But the reason I included it in this presentation is because if the simulation argument is correct, and especially if 1 and 2 are false or unlikely, then the world is very different than it appears at first blush. And because of this, this is something that the simulation argument and academic skepticism have in common. All right, so just to recap, we've covered Pyrrhonian skepticism, we've covered academic skepticism, especially Descartes' argument, and then we've covered the Moorean response to skepticism, the pragmatic response to skepticism, and the simulation argument.